Good morning, everyone. This is Ken Shorgen along with London Paul here with another podcast. And today, while we have spoken in the past quite often about what's going on with European politics and geopolitics as a whole, today we're going to shift over to the United States. Now, we're not going to limit it to just US politics, but we're going to take a look at the entirety, both local, national, and of course, how they use their hegemonic power and the decline that's happening right before our eyes. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of the discussion. And why don't you go ahead and take it off because this was a idea that you had for a good conversation.
Yeah, so hopefully it works out okay. But yes, thank you as well, Ken, for joining me. And it's always good that we do these things together. But yeah, I suddenly thought maybe it's a good point to assess, I guess, in essence, the declining and rapidly declining role of unipolarity, US hegemony, what we're seeing on the world stage, and how this is going to affect the United States, not just internationally, but domestically. We've got the presidential elections coming up in November, and obviously Biden is no longer going to stand for the Democrats, and it looks like it will certainly be Kamala Harris. So we can sort of factor some of those thoughts in, and maybe concerns about what may happen as a result of that election, and just generally to assess the status of the where the US is domestically, and can provide a bit more insight into some of the aspects of that than I certainly can. So I thought it was just an interesting discussion point, because often there is too much the idea that, well, the US will capitulate and it'll be the end of the United States forever, which it won't be. But equally, there's a school of thought that tends to keep suggesting that somehow the US will magically keep the world reserve currency, devalue the dollar, its manufacturing base will all return, the world will forgive the US, everyone will want US exports that cost 5 times as much as China or any other Southeast Asian countries, Africa, etc. And neither of those things are reality. And we always come back to the point, we want the United States to be a great nation amongst equal. I know a lot of Americans, including Ken, and they're good friends, and I want the US to succeed. I just don't like the administration and who is pulling the strings, or in the United States, to the detriment of it domestically and internationally, in its in terms of its reputation and standing and status.
Yeah, the United States has been an interesting bird, because obviously for Republicans, their great leader, goes back to Ronald Reagan. Trump Trump is a phenomenon, but Ronald Reagan, it was more of an icon. The problem is that during that era, you had at least U.S. the superpower that was the US, the Soviet Union. China was still out there, but it was really hadn't taken off yet. But it was the Soviet Union and the United States. And there was communication between the two. And eventually, detente changed into the collapse of the Soviet Union and the brave new world we saw post 1991. Unfortunately, the politicians who have run the United States ever since then, for the very most part, have either been strong leaders within the quote unquote military industrial complex, or they've been puppets of the military and intelligence complex. Case in point, when Donald Trump took over as president in 2016, he was able to do nearly everything he wanted to do domestically. The jobs, bringing back some jobs, getting the civil rights, uh, dealing with prison reform, etc. But the moment he started looking into Ukraine, instantaneously the impeachment came out and the attacks on him came out. So presidents today are not allowed to deviate or have their own ideas about foreign policy. And that foreign policy, of course, goes back to, we could say, the Wolfowitz Doctrine, that there will be no other superpowers to compete with U.S. hegemony and the like. But the problem is that now 30 some odd years later, we're getting almost to 35, 40 years. The United States is completely bankrupt. It has a lot of it's bandied about in the media of 120% debt to GDP. No, that is well over 200% and up there in the range of Japan's debt to GDP when you count everything that is owed or unfunded liabilities, et cetera. So the United States cannot financially hold on to this hegemonic control that they've had 800 plus bases around the world, using overt and covert means to control countries. And we've seen this since about 2014, when everything the United States has done has not really been to solidify their foreign policy, but it's either created chaos or it's brought about absolute loss and destruction. Talking about Libya, and then we can talk about Afghanistan. So everything we're starting to see is starting to crumble, similar in ways to parts of the Roman Empire, parts of the Greek Empire, many different, even the Ottoman Empire, where at certain points the empire is just too big and it costs too much and there's just not enough resources to contain it, and it starts crumbling from the outside. And this is what is leading to internal strife. And now we're seeing that both externally and internally.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the pinch points have been that the US could still function whilst the world bought US debt and gave US lots of free money to spend on whatever they wanted to spend. They obviously financialization of economies, we've spoken about that previously, was a disaster for the West and a disaster for the United States. And he didn't have a problem exporting huge swathes of its industry to China, whilst it thought China was going to westernize and be a dutiful vassal state. We'll give you all this business as long as you do what we tell you. And China basically went, no, that's not happening. And then the United States threw the toys out the pram. And it's the lack of trust, and how really ironically the Ukraine Maidan was the turning point, because within months the Chinese and the Russians signed the Power of Siberia 1, as we could call it now, gas pipeline deal, all to be transacted in non-dollar terms. And that was basically the trigger for a decade that very few people understand what's happened. And we've discussed it. I've done it in more my own podcast. Ken and I have done things in the past in various guises and discussed this. And it's only really grabbed the imagination of people maybe in the last year, 18 months, certainly coincides with the Ukraine war. But that's really been the catalyst, the Maidan, for when nations started to go, the US has overstepped the mark. This is, it's a European country. You've overthrown a democratically elected leader who basically had already agreed to a lot of the demands the US was pushing for anyway. And that was the point when countries stopped, not immediately, but the process started a little bit before, but certainly accelerated, not buying US treasuries. And therefore, the US started to then have some serious problems, notwithstanding what happened in 2008 when the financial system capitulated, because financialization was a very bad idea. And they carried on thinking that they could pursue that policy. And ultimately, we are where we are now with, as you say, Ken, debt to GDP is way higher. I would even argue it could be 400-500%. I mean, and I'm not exaggerating, because there's all this missing money as well, which you can add on maybe another 100, 200 trillion that's unaccounted for. The figure keeps growing. And that became a matter of national security when people started to find out that that was missing. And effectively, the US is now in the situation where its hegemony's dead, its reputation on the world stage is rapidly diminished. And That has been accelerated because of its policy decisions with respect to Ukraine. Forget its so-called allies, vassal states. Talking about the global south, the vast bulk of the world. The vast bulk of the world has also it's eroded its trust and relationship with the US because of Israel, where the US is caught between a rock and a hard place. That's why I always say the United States, this is the last thing in the world it needs, because it knew it was going to get caught between a rock and a hard place. It has no choice but to support Israel, but in the process deeply damages its relations. And also because all the sort of neo-colonial empires falling apart as well, which we've talked about Africa before as one example. And also, of course, in the process, the United States domestically, and this is where it's extremely important. So the one thing, it's foreign policy initiatives failing repeatedly. You mentioned, obviously, Afghanistan, but there's Iraq, there's Syria, Ukraine you can include in that. And the list goes on of failed attempts to overthrow leaders in the world, Belarus, Kazakhstan in recent years, and the list goes on. Just endless failing foreign policy decision. The Ukraine war has made the US military industrial complex look incompetent and very weak, which is deeply disastrous for the United States as well. And then domestically, its economy is cratering. US GDP figures are a complete myth, and a myth by a significant proportion. And of course, all the asset bubbles will have to burst, and they will burst at some point in the future. And that could be any day going forward. It doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow or next week, but we're in that kind of window now. And as ever, to achieve true equilibrium, asset prices will have to deflate to the true GDP, not the fictitious GDP. True GDP is probably 50% of what it is. And asset prices are just magnitudes higher than they should be. So if you look at how asset prices failed to reflect true GDP in 2008, what we're seeing now is orders of magnitude greater. So the fallout will be spectacular. But also, it's not just the fact, okay, an economy's blown up. The US then has to rebuild an economy based on reality, not financialization and fictitious sort of bubbles that create the illusion of a strong economy. And I think I'll hand back over to you, Ken, because I think that's a good point for both of us to comment on where we think the problems will be, what the US needs to do in terms of trying to recreate. Really, if you go back, and you're way more of an historian than I ever have been or ever will be, where I look back to the sort of late 1800s when the US economy was what it was. I'm not saying it goes back to that, but when it really was flourishing, and its economy was strong. And then, of course, it vaporized gradually as financialization kicked in. But I mean, I think it's a good point to get your perspective on how that economy can adjust in the future.
That's a very interesting point, because you bring up the 1800s. The reason that the United States actually had the growth that it had and thrived was because it had manifest destiny. It had frontiers to conquer. If you notice that when colonialism ended, the British Empire, the French Empire, all these European empires, they started losing their colonies. They started declining in GDP, in growth, productivity, and in power. When we finally hit the point that we hit the coast, what was the first thing that they desperately wanted? 1898. We need to start getting colonies like the Europeans do. So they, faked a war in the Spanish-American War and seized the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, etc. Okay, that's the biggest problem. Is the United States got out of the Depression because of one reason only, where the United States had the dominance over manufacturing and the financial system following not just Bretton Woods, but the World War II, was that Europe was devastated, and it took them about 15, 20 years to finally start getting back their manufacturing and their progress. This led, of course, to the decline of the dollar as the U.S. wanted to continue in the fight against communism and wars around the world, proxy wars, leading, of course, to the late 60s, where all of a sudden France and a number of other countries who were starting to come back didn't want dollars, they wanted gold, as the dollar was devaluing and causing inflation. So that, of course, led to the 1971 closing of the gold window and the stagflation as we transitioned almost overnight into a fiat currency system. That, of course, led to the oil crisis, as Arab nations didn't want any dollars because they were no longer gold backed. And it started, of course, that was really the beginnings of the US moving into what we see now as financialization. But even more so, the whole premise is there were no more real frontiers for the US to move into, uh, to go ahead and reap the resources and the largesse that would come, that we saw Europe get strong for 500 years over colonialization. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to you, Paul, to move forward, as financialization has really taken over the Western hegemonic system, and how reliance upon foreigners to pay for our debt and pay for our stuff is real. Buying dollars and bonds has really been the whole foundation and crux of what we are today.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you're absolutely right. When you go through the 70s and all the huge inflation and all the problems we saw economically and financially, and then they came up with this idea, really the British and the Americans, about financialization, and somehow we could make it all about the stock market, all about equities, or then subsequently all the other derivatives and everything else, and somehow magically this was the future. There'll be all this trickle down economics, where all this huge profit that was supposed to be made through reckless speculation, of course, was going to benefit the entire economy, and then we'll all become consumption based and we'll consume huge amounts of stuff, and that's the economic model, and it'll all work out swimmingly well. Well, obviously, one of the things as a result of that, we decided in our infinite stupidity, well, the Americans particularly, to export its manufacturing base to China, with all this idea that we thought, well, that will westernize China. China will become westernized. They'll acquiesce to our demands, and because we've given them all this industry, and they're going to profit hugely. And China went, thank you very much, and we're not going to westernize, which it took the Americans a long time to realize that. And you make the point about NAFTA, and etc. And it was just a period where the US completely failed to understand that this was a disaster. And this feeds in just very briefly about why I've talked about what I would call, and I'm going to call them the architects of multipolarity. It was that point in the late 90s where they turned around to the Russians and the Chinese and went, it's over for the Americans and the West, the dollar. It's not going to happen instantly, but you need to start thinking about the future. So, of course, China very happily joined the WTO and benefited hugely. And they were very grateful to accept, and were very surprised how generous the United States was to them. But in essence, in doing this, they then, of course, had the very flawed and failed .com bubble, which hemorrhaged trillions of dollars and produced nothing. That was another attempt to try and stimulate the economy, and it completely failed. And then we just went through, obviously, then by 2006, it was obvious again, all this speculation was going to blow everything up. And it did in 2008. And it was the Western financial crisis, not a global financial crisis. That was to try and convince everyone in the West it's not a Western problem. Well, it was a Western problem. China didn't even feel any of the effects of it. In fact, they bailed the West out. And really, even then, despite the fact the writing was on the wall and everybody should, at that point, have looked at this and gone, hang on, this financialization is a failure because look what it's done. I mean, we had basically the housing bubble and everything just blew, and that blew up nearly and would have taken the Western financial system down, only that we had the enormous bailouts. But instead of heeding the warning, and we went for QE zero interest rate policy, which, as I said, I wrote to governments at the time, said, do not do this. If you do it for a few months. After that, you cannot do this. You will destroy everything. I mean, no surprise they ignored me, and it doesn't remotely surprise me in any way, shape, or form. But the consequence of that is we just had more of the same. Years and years of QE, of zero interest rate policy. We still have QE, but they won't admit to it. And effectively in that process, all we did was then went, well, there's no way really out of this. We're not actually stimulating any manufacturing base whatsoever. All we're going to do is have more financialization, more asset bubbles, just endless asset bubbles. That's our answer. Somehow magically we'll work our way out of this. Then, of course, we had the pandemic, and the pandemic completely blew up in their face because they then had to print trillions to just bail everyone out and everything out to stop everything collapsing. And that then set in huge inflationary problems, which haven't gone away because structural inflation still exists. And then we have all the era of just completely false data. And now we're in a situation where we have these asset bubbles that are so big. And then we have GDP, which is totally inflated and is probably 50% less. And at some point, because it all has to happen, and it always happens, because that's exactly what happened in 2008, when the bubble bursts, the real GDP has to be matched by real asset prices. So if we think 2008 was a problem, whenever this happens, that is a drop in the ocean compared to what is coming. And that is the end of financialization, because it just there's no way back from it. The biggest problem the United States suffered, and really it was the start of de-dollarization, which is always the Achilles heel for the US. While everyone was buying US debt and giving the US free money, they could pretty much do what they want and get away with it. But once we had the Maidan and China and Russia announced the Power of Siberia gas pipeline, all traded in non-dollar terms, that was the beginning of the real end of the dollar, because contrary to conventional wisdom, de-dollarization has been going on for a decade. And this is why the United States wanted to crush and end Russia through the Ukraine war, why it wants to try and crush China. It doesn't particularly want a war, but it wants a way of demonizing China and having the entire world turn its back on it. Why? Because they are basically the architects and seen as the backbone of multipolarity, the end of the dollar as a world reserve currency. And the United States without the dollar is in serious trouble. This is why it's in serious trouble, because the world is turning its back on it. Why? Because no one trusts the United States. I mean, and obviously, ironically, the Ukraine war was effectively probably the final nail in the coffin lid, because they went and sanctioned the Russian central bank. They went and sanctioned other Russian banks, and also just basically confiscated their assets abroad, froze them. And the world went, well, you could do that to us. And the global south went, forget it, we're moving on. So this is why the United States now finds itself where its hegemony is over. But like all empires, it takes a while for that to be realized fully. And also the United States refuses to accept it in its mind. It knows it in reality, but it can't accept it, which is why now it keeps trying to have color revolutions and still trying to assert itself and sanction everyone and everything into oblivion who doesn't agree with it, even though the sanctions don't work, as Russia can testify. through what's happened with the Ukraine war. So effectively, we're now in that position where it's just how long is it before financialization completely capitulates? And then the question is, what does the United States do after that? And I think that's a point I could stop, because you can obviously talk about that, and then I'll, talk about it as well, Ken, because I think what I'm trying to say, I mean, obviously, if you've got anything else, please fill in what I've said, but I think we're at the point now where we're going to talk, well, what's the reality going to be going forward? And I want to come on to some of the points that people make, which bear no resemblance to reality. Is just wishful thinking, that somehow the US can dig its way out of a complete mess and come out the other side unscathed and still reap all the benefits of being a world reserve currency, which it can't do.
Yeah, exactly. And if you think about it, the United States really has been built, in the late 1890s, early 1900s. I don't remember the exact date. An author named Baum wrote a book called The Wizard of Oz. And it was an analogy of the entirety of what was going on in the US at that time. It was about the fight between the silver standard and the gold standard. The gold standard ended up winning. But what that also did is it proved that the US is really built on a foundation of controlling global currency. Bretton Woods, Bretton Woods was supposed to be something that brought the world together under a gold standard using a singular currency for a strong nation. That eventually got manipulated. Now it's been ripped and torn to the point that it's become weaponized, and the world now is rejecting it. So when the US finally loses absolute control over its unipolar, its global reserve currency domination, then the U.S. as a player in the global geopolitics is going to be absolutely over, because everything now is based upon reliance on the dollar for global trade, commerce, etc. And it reminds me, because it poses a question. Empires, for the most part, don't completely disappear. When Rome fell, it transitioned into a church. When the British Empire fell, it became a bank. So my question I would pose is, when the US empire finally collapses, what is it going to turn into to remain viable in the world, the future world?
Yeah, and it's a absolutely pivotal question. I mean, let's just look at the reality. There's I think an increasing recognition that for the United States to succeed in the future, it has to have a manufacturing base again. There's a realization financialization is dead, it's over, and that's true. But to have a manufacturing base, how does it do this? Well, I come back in very crude terms to use the analogy. It has to pay Chinese wages. Well, to do that, in relative terms, financialization be raised to the ground. That has catastrophic consequences. It's very hard to actually understand precisely what that means. But obviously, just for argument's sake, it will. Let's take the housing market. If housing prices should be 50-60% less, then that has just one instance of a serious impact on people. There's what's going to happen to the pension system, what happens to people's savings. I'm not saying, by the way, all banks will collapse and everyone loses their money, because that is unlikely. But the question is, what happens as the United States capitulates, and it inevitably will do what the only thing it can do, which is just to print money like there's no tomorrow and debase the dollar even more, because they can't face the risk like they did during the pandemic of how 300 million Americans, for example, will react to that, because the consequences will be severe. And we saw it, as I said, we saw it in the pandemic, so we know it's real. and they will have to respond. Contrary to a lot of people who go, they're all doing this deliberately. I'm sorry, if you want to believe that, fine, but it's absolute nonsense. But the point is, okay, let's assume that somehow they can create some stability and avoid serious societal unrest in the process of that collapse. The problem then is, how do they reinvigorate industry in the United States? They don't have a lot of the resources they need. It's very obvious, given the recent attempt to overthrow Maduro and claim the election was illegal, the US was behind it, why the US needs Venezuelan oil. Why does the US want Venezuelan oil? Because its own shale oil and gas reserves have clearly peaked. They could decline very rapidly. If the US wants an industrial base going forward, it needs cheap energy. It needs energy that's available. Now, let's imagine it doesn't have the energy. It lacks a lot of the resources it needs. And it's in an economy currently that has to pay people too higher wages. So there's this huge adjustment. Then the question is, and people think, well, the US can just have an internal economy. We don't need to export to the world. Well, here's the problem. If you leave things as they are or try to, it means I buy a widget for $1 from the Chinese. Now I'm paying $5, $8. You're going to have massive structural and inflationary problems, totally unsustainable. So the US cannot do that. The US also needs to have export markets. Well, who's going to trust the US? Because trust is easily lost and very hard to earn. So it has to go through those problems. Then there's this whole idea the US, since we've had inflation, can inflate its debt away. Well, it can't. If it keeps having massive fiscal budget deficit, it will never inflate its debt away. And that's why the debt keeps rising. Interest payments are rising. There's no possible chance of any sensible methodology of going, well, how do we deal with the fiscal deficit problem? No one's going to stop spending and spending and spending. Well, again, that's unsustainable. So the US faces a very difficult period because A, it needs to make friends with the global south. B, it will need access to resources. C, it needs to slash its cost of living base and make things affordable. And that's why it will have to go through a very difficult transition phase. There are no magical answers. I know for a lot of people in the West, and particularly in the US, they cannot understand a world where they're not hegemonic power because they've lived it their whole life, basically. I mean, you think effectively the US stepped into that role after World War II. So it's had, as near as damn it, 80 years. So to be honest, when you're a child, you don't really care about these things. So anyone who's probably 95, 96, 9, whatever, has always lived through this. So they're going to just, there's no comprehension that that can end. But when it does end, and it is ending, then what's the future for the US? And it's going to have to shut all its military bases all over the world, as one example. It can't have and it won't have a world reserve currency. Doesn't mean the dollar vanishes, but there won't be a world reserve currency. There doesn't need to be in the future. And therefore, it's the realization that there are no simple answers to what the US can do, but it has to start to build bridges with the rest of the world. It's going to need resources from the Russians and the Chinese. I mean, in the end, it may end up having to say to the Iranians and the Russians, we need your energy. I mean, and they've had a terrible relationship with both of those countries. But again, this is part of the just not thinking through the consequences of their behavior in the past and thinking we're always the hegemonic power and we can please ourselves and do what we like. But ultimately, everything boils down to one thing for the US, and that is the dollar has to remain the world reserve currency, no matter what. All foreign policy ultimately is dictated by that. So if any nation poses a threat, like Gaddafi did or Saddam Hussein did, then we have to have color revolutions, Arab Springs, whatever. And we have to remove the leadership. They can't do that anymore. They keep trying and they fail. So the other point with regards to this is when they finally understand and realize that it's over and there's no way back from it, then are they going to sit down at the table and have a more conciliatory approach to things? Well, that's very hard for anyone to believe. And the problem is, how long is it going to take the Russians to trust the United States? And for that matter, how long is it going to take the United States to trust Russia, in the sense of, because of all this ideological mindset? The thing with China is, okay, that's less of a problem, but if things started to escalate with Taiwan, then that becomes even a bigger problem as well. So there is no simple answer to it. Do I think in the end the US will come out the other side? Yes, I do. I've always said it can be a great nation amongst equals. I think there's a huge backbone of Americans who want that. And that, they'd be very happy with that. But politically, internally, it's a total mess, as we know. The Unity Party is reality. Can Trump change that? Well, that's a big question. I know Trump supporters want to believe it. Well, he didn't do it last time, so there's no reason to be confident he will do it this time either. The other thing is just internally, everything, all the infrastructure's crumbling. It needs to spend trillions to replace it. The healthcare system's failing, the education system's failing, society's failing. Just everything is a total mess. So you make the great point, to come back to your original comment. What does the US morph into? The US will have to morph into a nation which has credibility, trustworthy, can become a manufacturing base, can become, very high tech, very skilled, has educated workforce, and can have a manufacturing base and all the things it needs, and to be able to have access to all the resources and just transform itself. Really, I think, to be a modern day America of the 1880s, 1890s, that kind of era, where I think the US was peaking then in terms of what it was. It needed to carry on being that way. And, we could have been 100 plus years later looking at a very different world and a very different US. I think for me, historically, the US pushed the button at the wrong time and decided now's our time. We're going to be the hegemonic power. We're going to be the dominant global power. And they just weren't ready. They didn't have the maturity to do it. The nation wasn't established enough to make those decisions. And they've just made spectacularly bad decisions decade after decade after decade. And they've never learned. And they're not even learning now. And the sooner they learn and realize that the US as an hegemonic power is over, the better. And then they can start that rebuilding process. And that starts principally with rebuilding trust and the world to see the United States has integrity, because by the time all this is over, its Western allies will view the United States with the same disdain, probably, that the rest of the world, meaning the global South, currently does themselves.
Well said. Anyway, Paul, I think that's a good point to close. We've laid out the foundation as well as the potential future of what the United States hegemonic empire likely is going to proceed towards, and what the multipolar world is going to do in regards to its relationship with the U.S. Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this conversation.
And likewise, of course.
And to everybody here, don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe. And until the next time we get together, have a great start to the week.
And with that, I'll also say goodbye.